Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. Today we are finally completing our story analysis of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla with our full explanation of the DLC's ending and the meaning it had for Odin and the first civilization as a whole. We're also going to have a deep dive into the post-credits scene and Juno's situation at the end of the DLC with some more references to Assassin's Creed 3, the Salakar and the pedestal before we move on to a full explanation of a document that supposedly involves Adam, Eve and Baldr's resurrection among other things. Finally, based on everything we have seen in our entire analysis and especially in the ending of the DLC, we're going to try and share a theory as to why Eivor might have gone back to Vinland or North America in her final days. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's dive into the final episode of our Dawn of Ragnarok story analysis. So let's get back to the story. We left off where the characters stated that the Salakar artifact is half a key and the Surtur or his essence was the other half of the key, and that those had something to do with Juno's failed tower, and beyond the mythological veil, we can interpret that those are both the final key elements, the final means to make Surtur's plan work and thus to have the Salakar work with the tower in order to have the weapon of mass destruction that we discussed in our previous video, and thus to have this huge amount of energy and target it on a specific area of the world or even in the whole world, depending on what Surtur's idea was. So after Surtur tries and lure Odin towards himself and his opponent just says, "No, you," Odin flees towards the tower and Surtur kills Baldr. Eventually Odin reaches the tower, here called Meikin, which apparently means swords in Old Norse/Icelandic in the plural and accusative form, and the lower level of the tower is where Odin and Surtur have their final fight, which is even super easy, barely any trouble if you use the power of Muspelheim and thus get 0 damage. Thus Odin again emerges victorious, and this time, because they're under the tower, because Surtur is pinned to the ground by his Twilight sword, because all the elements for Surtur's plan are there, that is, the energy produced by Baldr's conscience, the Salakar, the tower, and Surtur's essence being reunited, because everything is there, and as Baldr said, because his Yisu body isn't able to contain all that, Surtur is finally killed by being consumed by the huge amount of energy released by all of this. So based on everything we saw, now it's easier to understand what Odin says before Surtur is killed. He sought to harness the power of the light, that is the energy created by Baldr's conscience inside the Salakar artifact, and being able to manage this energy through the use of the towers and to direct it wherever he wanted, all of that would have turned Surtur into a wrecker of worlds, as it is in the Norse mythology, because such weapon would have allowed him to subdue any kind of Isu group and territory. But Surtur's body was old and was also weak because he had been defeated twice, and thus all that energy instead consumed him. And because the energy released here isn't contained, controlled and directed by Surtur's body and essence, it actually gets channeled by the Salakar towards the top of the tower and then towards the sky in a presumably uncontrolled way, because no one was there to direct the beam and use the tower, which had been reprogrammed into a weapon. And thus Odin walks away, happy for getting his revenge and for finally being able to kill Surtur once and for all without him being renewed anymore, and especially unbeknownst to the fact that that uncontrolled beam will be the cause of his own demise. And that was the ending of the DLC, which sort of, slightly, almost makes sense under this series of hypotheses that we created based on that tiny document placed in the middle of nowhere that we mentioned in our previous video. But my question is, how did you all react while playing and finishing this DLC? I've read so many reactions of people stating that the DLC ended abruptly and so many fans not really understanding anything of what was happening there. I myself did believe it was one of the worst endings I had seen in an Assassin's Creed DLC because in itself it did not contain all the elements to properly understand what was happening there, nor to understand what Surtur's plan actually was. So once again, no, as it stands, even if it seems to have some ties to the old games that might even look interesting, the DLC, in the state where it was released, does have a lot of flaws, not only in terms of story, but also in terms of how the story is conveyed, and it was not worth its $40 price. Nonetheless, as you might already know, there's still a post-credit scene that we have to analyze and that will lead to some more juicy and interesting stuff. So after defeating Surtur and leaving the Salakar under the tower for reasons that I can't fathom, Odin returns to the Hoda shelter to share news of his victory, only to find Juno waiting for him there. Juno explains that while Odin was so busy with his quest to save Baldr and then to take his vengeance, apparently Loki freed himself from the prison Odin put him in, he freed his son Fenrir too, woke his son Jormungandr and rallied her daughter Hel, along with raising a huge army. The information here is very interesting, even though again it happens off screen, but in this case I'm not too mad about this, because this is a classic cliffhanger at the end of an Assassin's Creed story, so I guess we could see this in the future, who knows, maybe in Basim's memories in the rumored Assassin's Creed Rift project, and that's not the only thing we could see in that game. In fact, Juno also adds that now Odin will have to face Loki's army, the North African Isu prone to get their vengeance for their leader Surtur, and the Greco-Roman Isu led by Jupiter who also wants to settle his score after Odin stole the Seventh Method, so Odin's vengeance apparently put him in an even worse situation that might need to be taken into consideration by future writing teams, and if Loki was at the center of it all, we might see glimpses of that in Rift as well. If only now we have plenty of reasons why the Asgardian Isu, after using the Seventh Method, had to go out in the streets of the Asgardian territory fully armed with several swords of Eden to face their end. But the nail in the coffin for Odin, if all of that isn't enough, is that Juno here shows that once again the prophecies, or shall we say the calculations, properly predicted the future. In fact, by using Surtur's Twilight Sword and emitting the light, or shall we say energy beam, in the sky, Odin made another prophecy or calculation true, as that sword was destined to start the Tova catastrophe / Ragnarok, which mirrors the Norse mythology. Thus Juno confirms that it was Odin himself who started the process that would have led to Ragnarok and then to his own demise, and beyond the mythological veil, it looks like Odin, through the use of the Salakar and the tower itself, with that uncontrolled surge of energy caused by Baldr's conscience, set in motion a process that instead of targeting only a specific territory in the world, as I imagine Surtur's plan was about, actually led to the solar flare that caused the Toba catastrophe that engulfed the entire planet. And while this may seem slightly interesting in hindsight, it's also at least debatable whether this goes against the idea of the catastrophes being destined to happen again and again as it was hinted in Assassin's Creed Origins or not, because I might be mistaken here, but I'm not too sure it was established that all the recurring catastrophes would have actually been solar flare caused by time itself. After all, for example, the potential occurrence of the catastrophe in Valhalla was caused by Basim overclocking the Yggdrasil temple and influencing the Earth's magnetic field. And thus Odin, of course inadvertently, also started a process that would have led to his own demise, because remember, now that Loki has freed Fenrir, that calculation too can finally come to fruition, but with this act of vengeance, Odin also condemned the entire Isu race to its end. Apparently though, Odin's course of action wasn't a shocker for everyone. In fact, there was at least one scholar that was able to foresee all of this and even some potential future events. Their notes can be found once again in A3. I told you that's the area with the most interesting content in the DLC, and in them we can see a bullet list of events that this scholar was able to experience through some kind of calculations, which can help us understand a bit more of the flow of events. So the calculations predicted that Baldr would have been killed, that supposedly he was going to be stored in the Salakar, and that the process leading to the Toba catastrophe would have been started as all the enemies of the Asgardian Isu would have gathered together to attack them, including Loki's armies, his sons, the Greco-Roman and the North African Isu. After that, Lif and Lithrazir, who supposedly are the mythological veil names for Adam and Eve, not to be confused with Ask and Embla, who were supposedly the first humans, not hybrids, created by the Asgardian Isu. Adam and Eve potentially would have hidden during the catastrophe quote-unquote under a great tree, which we can imagine to maybe represent the Yggdrasil vault or some other kind of similar temple where they actually would have survived the solar flare impact as the battle between the Asgardian Isu and everyone else raged on, and where Odin was predicted to die at the hands of Fenrir, thus finally fulfilling the prophecy that we saw in the main game. So according to this calculation, the catastrophe would have actually hit the earth and the world would have burned, here represented by the sun and moon being devoured by giant wolves and the 9 realms crumbling and sinking. And then the calculation seems to be more uncertain, with some question marks written here and there. The world would have supposedly survived the impact of the solar flare, here represented as the world reborn, and only after that Lif and Lithrazir, that is Adam and Eve, would have emerged from the Yggdrasil vault or equivalent temple, which also kind of follows the accounts from the Norse mythology. They would have helped repopulate the world and also rebuild it along with the survived Isu. And finally, potentially, at some point this scholar, who was not Odin, they predicted Baldr to be resurrected, which is also an event that happens in the Norse mythology, but beyond the mythological veil, it seems that this calculation already predicted Baldr to be resurrected after the Toba catastrophe hit the earth. So keep this in mind, as it will be pretty important for our final theory at the end of the video. As a last goodbye with Juno, Odin offers his unholy partner to go back to the tower and grab the Salakar, as he believes that the artifact can allow to deliver, that is, allowed to save and then revive, the person that she loved, that is the Isu Aita. I believe that the reasoning behind this is that the Salakar can store more than one Isu conscience, and at some point said consciences could also be extracted from the artifact and brought back to life in some kind of vessel, as it was the case for the 7th method itself, and even for the 6th method of salvation that Juno used to transfer her conscience in the Grand Temple machinery and then out of it. But as Odin had mentioned before, the Salakar was full, and thus to store different essences it had to be emptied first. Thus, while Juno says that she already has a plan for Aita, that would be the Aita sages which we have seen started with Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, it looks like Juno might have even used the Salakar to store Aita's conscience inside of it, and maybe a copy of her own one too, though as of now we have seen that in order to store a conscience inside the artifact, it must be taken directly from the body of the host, and Aita is already dead by now, and Juno will actually die in the Grand Temple. Nonetheless, if Juno had managed to make it, the Salakar would have stored their consciences, it would have survived the Toba catastrophe, and then their conscience could be free to be transferred into another vessel at any time, which also shows how Juno and Aita could still potentially come back in Assassin's Creed at any time should the writers want it to go that way. But of course, during the Isu era, Odin wasn't just generous with Juno, he actually had a plan, or at least a hope connected to Juno's use of the Salakar. If she were to succeed with it, if she was able to upload Aita's conscience or even hers in the Salakar, survive the Toba catastrophe and then release them in the world, even Baldr's conscience could have had the same fate, and that wouldn't only allow Baldr to survive the catastrophe as it was calculated by that scholar, but it might have also allowed Odin to maybe meet him again somehow after he was reborn. And who's to say that maybe that's why Eivor, at some point fully realizing that she is a reincarnation of Odin, as he directly states in the DLC while looking at the camera, maybe looking at Eivor directly like Minerva was looking at Desmond in her speech in Assassin's Creed 2, who's to say that maybe that's why Eivor decided to go back to Vinland one day in order to meet Baldr again. Maybe her final voyage to North America has the purpose to go back to the Grand Temple where she originally didn't want to go, enter it, find the Salakar / pedestal that Juno brought there, and meet Baldr's conscience once again after tens of thousands of years, in a similar way as to how Basim met Alethea's conscience on the far side of their doom. That would be poetic and amazing, so I don't expect it to necessarily happen, but narrative director Darby McDavid did hint at the team potentially being working on something connected to Eivor's return to Vinland. But as usual, we're going to have to wait and see if that turns out to be true. And that was it both for this video and for our analysis of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. What do you guys think of the ending and the explanations that we suggested? Do you agree with it, or do you think we missed some details? What about the post-credits scene? Do you think it will lead to something solid in the future? And finally, what are your opinions on our theory about why Eivor is going back to Vinland? Let us know all of that in the comments below. Thank you for following us through the entirety of this series. This time it was tougher than usual, but we all got through the end. So thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.